Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here, and my guest today is a quilter, a book author, and an award-winning artist, and a teacher and instructor in quilting, Cindy Grisdela. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Welcome to my channel. So, I stumbled on your Instagram account, and it immediately caught my eyes just because of all the brilliant colors and how unusual your quilts are. But you started with traditional quilts initially, right?
I did, yes. Long time ago. I made traditional quilts for a long, probably 15 years. And then got to a point where I just got tired of following patterns and wanted to see what I could do on my own.
So did you feel like you needed bravery to basically like step outside of the traditional rules of quilting?
Yes, I think you do. But I did it over a period of time. It wasn't like I woke up one morning and said, oh, I'm going to be an improv artist now. I just started, I started taking traditional patterns and sort of tweaking them and making them in non-traditional fabrics and changing up I mean, you can see if you look at my work, I've always been really attracted to log cabin quilts and to drunkard's path curved quilts. So I'm still sort of playing with those ideas today.
When I'm talking to traditional quilters, oftentimes they would talk about like the precise 90 degrees angles and how the two pieces of fabric has to connect just in the right spot. Is that like almost counterintuitive? Was it counterintuitive for you at the beginning to like step away from that? Because when I'm looking at your quilts now, I'm almost like, well, shouldn't it join right here? Like, why is it like the join is like a little bit off-centered? Like, does that bother you ever?
It doesn't. Absolutely, it does not. And I have an undergraduate degree in art history. And so I spent a lot of time as a college student and then, as sort of a lifelong learner studying, other artists and how they do things. And I just came to feel that the emphasis on points having to match and the preciseness of it. If you look at antique quilts, a lot, even though they were traditional, a lot of times they were not perfect. They were made by hand. They were made, by the light of a kerosene lantern or whatever. And so I think that it's, there's often that piece that doesn't quite fit, or I call them happy accidents. And you couldn't plan it, but when something comes together, two colors come together to create a new shape that you didn't intend, I think that's just really exciting. So it doesn't bother me if things don't match.
Think about like history of quilts. So traditionally, quilts were very practical items. Basically, people would use like their old cloth or like some scraps from other projects and create this, for like better term, blankets, right?
Right.
You emphasize in like all the interviews that I watched, all your presentations, that you prefer your quilts to be hung on the wall. Was that from the very beginning? How was that progression happening? Like when you were making first quilts, the traditional quilts, did you see them as work of art, or was that more practical kind of approach?
Oh, great question. No, they were absolutely practical. I was making quilts for the beds. I've always just been really excited and interested though about the fact, and when I discovered quilting, there weren't any quilters in my family. And so I don't come from a quilting tradition necessarily. I learned how to sew when I was a kid and made clothing and kind of discovered traditional quilt making by accident. And I was just really drawn by the idea of making something beautiful that could also be useful. And I did that for years, made bed quilts, made baby quilts, made things for people to use. And I still do that. I don't make bed quilts anymore, but I do still make baby quilts and things for people to use. but I got to the point where I had so many ideas that I wanted to explore that making them in a smaller format, basically for the wall, allowed me to explore more of those ideas and make more progress as an artist, I think, than I would have been able to do if I was, still making them bed size and needing to be made to be used.
Well, when I'm looking at your quilts, right, the question that pumps to my mind, like they look, when people say improvisational, there is this idea of like, oh, you don't have a plan, you just throw it together, however it's going to happen. And I don't think that's true when it comes to your quilts. How much planning, how much thinking goes into making of your quilts?
I love that. I love that question. Because when I teach, I am, or lecture or whatever, this is something that I say, improv is not just, making a whole bunch of blocks and throwing them up on the wall and sewing them together willy-nilly. I mean, and maybe that comes back to me having this, this design background. I want and the title of my first book is called Artful Improv. I want them to be, to be more intentional, I guess. And so, but that being said, I'm a very intuitive, organic kind of an artist. So I might make a rough sketch of something that idea that I have. I don't use a computer program or anything like that. I just want to dive in and, cut up the fabrics and create my shapes, put them on the design wall, and then just arrange them and rearrange them until I have something that really makes my heart sing. I mean, that's sort of the key of it, is to get in touch with that creative muscle that we all have and listen to it. Because we're all so different, and we all make our quilts, our art, in our own unique way. That's something that I feel really passionate about. So I make a whole bunch of units or blocks or elements. I generally have, I don't work from a pattern, I don't use templates, but I generally have an idea, a structure that I want to use to create whatever it is that's in my head. But then I'm open to change. I'm open to pivoting if I get those elements up on the design wall and they don't play like I thought they were going to, or they need something different than I thought. So the whole process evolves as I create.
I was watching on YouTube a studio visit, basically like a guided visit to your studio. Is there like a naughty corner for something that doesn't behave the way you want it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have what I call a leftover basket. And so anything that doesn't work in a particular quilt, which happens all the time. I like to say that improv is a lot like sourdough bread. You're going to have leftovers and you're going to use those to make your next project. So if something doesn't turn out exactly the way I planned or I wanted or whatever, it goes into the leftover basket and lives there for a while. And sometimes with time, I pull that out and say, oh, I could do, this or that with it. It didn't work in the first project, but it might work somewhere else.
Do you ever get inspiration from that basket?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Sometimes I've just been involved in, if you go to my Instagram feed, I've just been involved in sort of a studio refresh because I'm a very messy creator, and I just, things have gotten a little out of hand. So I went in and I've sort of rearranged some things in my studio, and I went to the leftover basket. And it was kind of like an archaeological dig in there, going, trying to go through it and say, oh, wow, yeah, I remember that. And pulling some things out and saying, oh, maybe these are, these have marinated long enough. I can do something with them.
Well, let's talk about your fabric stash. So when you started doing traditional quilts, you used a lot of printed fabrics.
Right.
Now, most of the fabrics that you use is one color sort of fabric. Do you still incorporate your old stash into your new quilts?
They go on the back. The print fabrics go on the back, and they are, I cut them up into, sort of slabs of, maybe there's a fat quarter that has a bite taken out of it from something else. I'll just sort of square things up and create backs. I don't really use print fabrics much on the fronts, on the tops of my quilts anymore. And the reason for that is not that I don't love print fabrics, because I absolutely do. It's just that I feel like using the solid color fabrics is more, I get a more graphic, painterly style of design. So you can see the lines and the shapes that I'm creating really, really well. Sometimes when you use print fabrics, the lines blur a little bit because the eye isn't sure whether it wants to focus on the lines and shapes that I'm creating or on the pattern in the fabric. So I haven't gotten rid of my print fabrics, and I use them, I use them on the back, or sometimes, like just recently I got a commission to make a wall hanging for the mother of a friend of mine. And she liked a quilt that I had made a while ago that used batik prints. And so I said, sure, I still have some of those, and I'll be happy to make you a quilt using those fabrics. So I still have them, but mostly they get used on the back.
Is there like ever fabric that you look at and you're like, I don't know what I was thinking when I bought it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. When I was a new quilter, I had a friend who said to me, Cindy, you have to buy, if you really like a fabric, you have to buy 3 yards of it, because you never know if you're going to need it for a border or a back or something. And I did that a few times, and I thought, wow, that ends up with a lot of big pieces of fabric, and I don't work like that. I've always been kind of a scrap quilter, and plus, how could I afford to do that? That's just way too much. So sure, I mean, you're in the heat of the moment in a shop or at a show or something, or with a friend, and isn't this wonderful? And you buy something and it turns out to be not so wonderful. And conversely, the same thing happens. You buy something and you get a fat quarter of it, and you bring it home and open it out. You say, oh my goodness, I wish I had 3 yards of this.
Well, I mean, is there like favorite set of colors or favorite color that you always tempted to buy?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. When I first started, I mean, I'm kind of known now for fairly fearless use of color. I mean, you noticed it in my Instagram feed. But when I first started out, I was very timid about color, very, very timid. I made a lot of blue quilts. I mean, a lot of blue quilts. And so I worked out of that. I got to a point where I felt more comfortable with, more warmer colors. I love all the colors, really, but I end up mostly with very strong saturated colors. You can maybe see them in the back of on my wall here. I love, lime green and hot pink and purple and royal blue and all kinds of those wonderful, wonderful warm colors.
Recently, I saw you making one of the quilts that was like very pastel, actually. There's like a little bit of accents. Do you specifically, like on purpose, take yourself outside of your comfort zone and challenge yourself to something that you don't normally do?
Yes, I think that's really important to do, because you can get into a rut, making quilts, making a lot of blue quilts. I mean, nothing wrong with blue. I love blue, but especially in 2020, when I stopped traveling to teach and lecture, I deliberately challenged myself to use fabrics and colors that were not comfortable. And I made several, sort of less saturated, almost dull color quilts. But one of the things that I like to do when I am working in that sort of a palette is to add in what I call the spark. And that's if I'm using a lower saturation, so by saturation, I mean the brightness of the fabric. So if you're using fabrics that read less saturated, even a little dull, sometimes it really perks things up to throw in just a little bit of turquoise or lime green or whatever, and it gives the eye a little bit of a pop. and it's unexpected. And I like to do that in my work.
Well, when you teach, what's the most difficult thing about improvisational quilts? Because like to me, I mean, it's like in everything else, right? People can follow the pattern. When you explain people how your creative process works, and this is first step, second step, and so on, they can follow the instructions. But then when it comes to them, to themselves coming up with the ideas, it's like suddenly there's like crickets and you have zero ideas. What's the most difficult thing as a teacher to like push people to think outside of their comfort zone?
Well, that's an interesting question. And it depends a lot of times how I'm teaching. If I'm teaching in person, it's a lot easier to, kind of engage with a student and talk to them about, why did they sign up for this class? What did they want to get out of it? I had a student recently who really had a hard time making color choices. And that was part of some other things that, that had happened in her life. And so it's a challenge in that kind of a situation to, to kind of give the person permission to play. And so she was having trouble picking the solid colors because she didn't normally use them, but she had brought a stack of hexes, I think, that were patterned fabrics. And I said to her, take one of those fabrics that you love and pull your solid fabrics from that. That person that designed that fabric has gotten paid a lot of money to make sure those fabrics, those colors look good together. And so if you like it, then use that. And so so that was, sort of an interesting in-person experience with somebody was just sort of, the idea of choosing colors and making blocks without a pattern was really challenging for that person. If I'm teaching on Zoom, it's a little bit different. And the hardest thing with that is that if I am demonstrating a technique, for example, how to sew curves, and the person has trouble with, sort of spatial dynamics, and because when you sew a curve together, it looks like it doesn't fit, and it's a little bit unnerving if you're not used to it. So I can't over Zoom go in and touch the fabric and show them, so I have to come up with different ways to show that student how to sew that seam, different ways than the original, and that's sort of a challenge. But I love teaching. I love interacting with my students, and when they come to that sort of aha moment, I got it. That's so exciting.
Well, I recently interviewed an Irish artist, Kathy Ross. So Kathy does freehand machine embroidery, and she was telling me how when she teaches kids, and she tells them like just do that, they don't question that, oh, it can be done. They just like, okay, and they go for it, right? But when you teach adults, there is this whole accumulation of their life experiences, and they're not sure that this is permittable, that this is how you do it, is that the rules. Do you find that when you teach people with less experience in quilting, it's easier to get them to the improvisational quilt than people who like have been quilting for 50 years?
It depends. One of the first things I say in my class is, you cannot make a mistake in my class. So many people are worried about doing it wrong. And in improv, there is no wrong. There's things that turn out better or worse than you expected, but there's no wrong. And so that seems to sort of break the ice with people. And I've had it both ways. I've had students who were very experienced who really took to this. I've had students who come in and say, Cindy, I'm a perfectionist. And I'm thinking, oh boy, that's going to be a challenge. But she was there because she wanted to, step outside her comfort zone. And then I had a child in a class one time, a 10, 12-year-old child who was so precise and wanted to do it exactly. She wanted hers to look exactly like mine. And that's tough because it's improv. And so it's really interesting to all the different kinds of people that you get to meet and interact with as a teacher. And you know, sometimes the challenges you think you're going to have are not the ones that you end up with, but it's all fun.
Well, how do you think you have changed as a teacher, as an instructor, like from when you first started to where you now?
Well, I didn't start teaching until I was writing my first book. And so what I did was I taught the way I would like to be, taught. And I don't want people to feel like there are lots of rules. I don't want people to feel badly about anything that they do in my class. I want them to, they may not all become improv artists, but maybe they'll be able to take some technique or tip or something that I give them and incorporate it into their own practice. So I find that I'm very, I don't know, what's the word? I'm a little bit laid back. You know, I don't have a prescriptive approach to, you know, this is how it has to be done. And I'm open to, you know, I've had people say, well, Cindy, you know, there's a better way to do that. And sometimes, you know, that's, you know, kind of problematic, but on the other hand, maybe it is. And so I try to be, you know, very, I feel, I guess the thing is, as I have become, as I have taught more, I have become a better teacher. I've learned from my students, and I am, you know, I'm comfortable in my role. And that's the big thing, I guess. I feel comfortable in my role as a teacher.
You told me that you are very introverted in nature, like in general. Was it difficult for you to put yourself out there with the book, with the exhibitions, with the teaching? Like, was that pushing you outside of your comfort zone?
It was a little bit, but I had, in probably 2005, I joined a multimedia art group, local group in my community, and they encouraged me to, you know, participate in these little local shows and offer my work for sale and put my work up in, you know, local exhibits. And I was nervous about it at first because I am an introvert, and you know, getting up in front of, you know, talking to a whole bunch of people made me nervous. But I realized I can talk for a really long time about something that I love as much as art and quilting. And, you know, and then I spent 10 years before the pandemic. I traveled all around the United States showing and selling my work at fine art and fine craft fairs. So I would set up a booth and people would come, and, you know, if they weren't interested in my work, then they would just walk on by. And, you know, but people who were interested would come in and talk to me, and I met some really wonderful people that way. So then when I started teaching, you know, I started teaching when I had a book to teach from. So that gave me some credibility, I think. And I find that it's something I enjoy.
Well, how is your first? So the first book was the Artful Improv, and then recently you published the Adventures in Improv Quilts. How are they different from each other? Like, what pushed you to make a second book?
Well, when I wrote Artful Improv, I meant it as sort of a guide for students, quilters who wanted to sort of make the leap from following traditional patterns to making, you know, more improvisational work. And Artful Improv basically focuses on 5 different techniques that I use in my work. And I you know, show them, I talk about them, I talk about color, I talk about design considerations, I talk about free motion quilting, but there weren't any patterns in the book. And it was one thing that I heard from students and readers, that they wished that there had been, you know, a little more guidance in Artful Improv. And so I wrote Adventures to provide a little more guidance to people who are maybe have, have gotten the basics of improv, but are not really sure about how to use the techniques to create their own work. And so Adventures has several what I call guided exercises. They're not patterns, but they give more information about how to make a specific kind of quilt, from pretty easy to a little more challenging to a lot more challenging. And so it also talks about color and design and free motion quilting, because that's what I'm about. But that's the big difference, is those guided exercises that that you can take and really use the techniques and make something your own.
Well, I saw a video where you showed basically the Improv Log Cabin square, how you're making that and how you're approaching it. And it was very interesting because, like, not only you use different colors and different angles, like it's not straight lines. It's like some of them are straight and some of them go crooked. And then you use not necessarily just pre-cut pieces of fabric, like sometimes you use some leftover from another quilt that's going to be not as wide, and like, so there's like a lot of very interesting things happening in that. Why did you decide to start, like, to sort of reference it to the log cabin design? Like, why, what was that between this parallel between the traditional and the improv that you were fascinated about?
I thought that it would be accessible to people who were familiar with the traditional the traditional log cabin, because it's put together the same way from the center out. You add your logs onto the outside of a center. The just difference is that the logs are different colors. They don't have light and dark like the traditional log cabin. They can be different widths. They can be different, different sizes, and I like to include little scrappy bits, little pieces that were cut off from another project, and I put them together into stripes. And that technique has been really well received, because I think because it's accessible, it's something that people know, but it's a totally different way of putting things together that again, there's no rules, there's no right or wrong way to do it. If you don't like it, you can I had a student once who said, I like this half of the block, and I don't like that half. And I said, well, just cut off the block part you don't like. She said, really? You can do that? Sure. It's improv.
Well, if somebody comes to an exhibition and one of your quilts are there, do you think there is going to be immediate recognition that this is Cindy Grisdela's style of quilting? Like, do you have that style that people associate you with? And the second part of that same question, if there is certain look to your quilts, does that scare you that you limited in that sort of style?
I have had people tell me that, that they saw one of my quilts at an exhibit and they knew right away that it was mine. It doesn't really scare me, because I feel like I have now a recognizable style, but it isn't something that I'm doing the same thing over and over again. I have different techniques that I like to use. I have different approaches to creating improvisationally, but they all, share, I think, an approach to color, sort of an approach of free approach to design that is that's recognizable. And one of the things, I mean, you didn't ask this, but one of the things that I am concerned a little bit about as a teacher, that I'm teaching all these techniques to my students, and so I have to keep evolving as an artist in order to become a better artist and also to become a better teacher. I have to keep, I can't stay in the same rut making the same kinds of quilts over and over and over again. I have to keep growing.
When we talk about quilting, there is part of it that you're an artist and you're doing this improv quilts that it's going to be on the wall in some house, so it's a piece of art. On the other hand, quilts traditionally thought as craft. What's your relationship with this topic? Like, how do you decide on pricing, let's say, because you used to sell at craft fairs? How do you price it as art and not craft? Like, how do you educate public about the art side of it versus craft side of it?
Well, I felt like that's one of the things I did as a, as a traveling, art fair artist. I was often the only or one of a few fiber artists in a particular show. And I thought of my role as educating the, the art buying consumer about, quilts as art. I mean, there certainly is a craft to it. And I think that craftsmanship is vitally important in the creation of my work and many other people who create quilts as art. And I had a really not as difficult a time as I expected, sort of educating non-quilters about the idea of quilts being art as opposed to craft. And I think that part of it is because I have sort of a painterly approach to my art. I am, fascinated with color and how color interacts. And I'm also really focused on the texture that I'm adding with the quilting stitches. And that texture most times is integrated into the design concept. It's not just a way to hold the 3 layers together. And so that was something that people really related to when I was out in the world, showing my work like that they, that they appreciated that part of the artistry of it that isn't, the painters don't really have that opportunity to add texture and another whole composition on top of the design that they've created. And so I focused on those unique qualities of fabric as art. You can't convince everyone, but I sold a lot of work, and people seem to really appreciate it.
Is there like ever a low moment in your life when you question that, like, why I'm doing that? Because you used to be a financial journalist also, like you had another career prior to this. Do you ever look back and ask yourself, like, why did I stop doing this? Like, I didn't need to talk to people. I didn't need to explain why I'm charging what I'm charging. I just did my thing. Like, do you ever get into that kind of situation?
I do not. I am so happy every morning to get up and be able to do what I love. I kind of feel like I've come full circle, and I started out as an artist in high school and college. I pursued that art history degree, but I took a lot of studio art classes as well. But when I graduated, I thought, that's going to be a little hard to make a living with. And so I have always been really interested in business and finance. I got a master's degree in business finance, and I did the financial journalism for a number of years, and I really enjoyed that. But now I feel like I've kind of come full circle, where I've incorporating my interest in art, my interest in business. I run my own business now, and I realized I forgot to answer your question about pricing. I price my work by the square foot, just like any other artist in a 2-dimensional medium would. And I base my pricing on what for years, what worked to sell at the craft shows. And I also pay attention to, to trends in the marketplace and things like that. So my business, my business sense sort of, and my art sense are sort of walking hand in hand. And I'm thrilled every single day to be fortunate enough to do this.
Well, when you create the quilt, right? Some of the quilts that you make are larger, some of them are basically like little painting size, and you frame those and you make like pillowcases. And this is where, like, this is exactly what we're talking about. This is the business part of you, that what would sell, what would people imagine in their homes and use for home decor and like buy easier. when you wake up in the morning, do you think about those things? Do you think, okay, like I need to prepare stuff for the fair, so I'm gonna just concentrate on little sellable things instead of going after your artistic, whatever like tickles your artistic fancy of the morning?
I used to. I'm not doing the art fairs anymore, and so I have a little more freedom that way. But the smaller pieces, the most popular ones were 12 by 12 squares, and I made them little compositions, and I mount them on painted black canvas, and then they hang on the wall like a painting. That was one of the things that I did to kind of educate the non-quilting art buying public, that they knew exactly what to do with that little piece to hang it on the wall, as opposed to a quilt with a sleeve and a slat that they're not so sure. But when I was doing that, you have to have, or I felt that I had to have a big statement piece or two to draw people into the booth. And then I had, I needed to have a variety of price points, from those little small pieces to the big statement piece that was going to cost thousands of dollars. And so when I was doing that, yes, there were days when I was in production mode. I was making those little 12 by 12s. But sometimes those 12 by 12s were sort of practicing or auditioning new designs or new compositions that I could work into a bigger piece. So I always was trying to think about, how is that going to, how is that going to work? I do still have some space in a small co-op gallery in locally here, so I do still make the small pieces sometimes, but I'm freer now to to really focus on the bigger sort of statement art pieces.
Are you ever out of ideas? Do you ever have creative blocks? Like, do you wake up and you're like, okay, I have zero idea what I'm gonna make today?
Yes. I think everybody does. And or if you were working and things just were not things, in improv, because you don't have that pattern, sometimes things just don't work. You spend a day or a couple of days working on something, and it just doesn't come together. And when that happens, I typically just leave it, put it aside. I have a generous sized design wall now, which is really nice. So I can put that one to the side and work on something else. But a lot of times, if I'm really blocked, there's a couple things I do. One, I have scraps. I keep scraps. I always have. And I keep them organized by color on my cutting table. And I just, pick one and dump it out and start making those little improv blocks with the scraps and the stripes and all that. And sometimes I just go to my art books and I start, looking through and, getting inspired. Or you can also do a studio refresh, which is what I did the other day when I was feeling a little bit blocked. And then you have to, for me anyway, whenever I'm doing something in my studio, but not as creative as I would like, my brain is working and ideas will come. I have this little quilt that I purchased that says, it has my favorite Picasso quote, and it says, "Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working." So I'm in the studio every day, whether I am, making something wonderful or I'm just sewing together scraps. And, you never know when an idea is going to hit you, and it usually does.
Well, you told me that you visited 63 national parks. Does nature inspire you? Like, where do you draw your inspiration besides art? Like, what else gives you ideas?
Yes, I do. My husband and I embarked on a family quest about 25 years ago to take our kids to all the national parks in the United States. I love to travel. I love getting out in nature. Sometimes it's you see these wonderful colors in nature, or shapes sometimes. So even though my work is very abstract, I'm always on the lookout for an interesting color combination, or a shape constellation that that I hadn't thought of before. And that can be in nature. It can be also can be buildings. I'm always just trying to be aware of my surroundings when I'm, when I'm out and about, and trying to take, take inspiration from, from that.
You ever look back at your quilts and then the square in your hands and think like, oh, I wish I could put this square over here?
Yes. And that's what working in a series is all about. So, so then you start something else with that idea. And sometimes sometimes it morphs into something completely new. Like this quilt behind me, I started out with an idea. I was making, a new version of a quilt I had made, and I started out with that idea and started laying things out, and the whole thing just wanted to go in a different direction. And so, I've learned to kind of roll with that and make it happen, and it usually works out well.
You ever talk to your quilts?
I talk at them sometimes. Yeah, I was I was working on a quilt that I was on a deadline for the other day, and it's just one of those days where the thread broke, or the bobbin wasn't winding properly, or just especially when you're in a hurry, you're on a deadline, sometimes things like that happen, and I talk at them. Yes, when that goes on. Not that it really helps, but it makes me feel better.
During that visit to the studio, I saw you have this beautiful loom standing there. What's your background with the fiber arts? Like, what else have you done besides quilting?
Well, I did some weaving a long time ago. I have this beautiful handmade 8-shaft loom that I love. I haven't done any weaving in years, but I keep thinking, well, maybe I'll get back to it at some point. I've done just about, I don't know, most crafts. I've done knitting, I've done crocheting, at cross stitch, needlepoint. I had a great aunt who, I grew up in the South in Florida, and I had a great aunt who kind of took me under her wing when I was a child. And she was of the old school and felt that, little girls need to know how to do all of these needlework things, like you read about in colonial times. And so she taught me, how to do needlepoint and cross stitch and all of those things. And so I tried a lot of things, and I was fortunate to grow up in a family where my parents really encouraged my interest in art. So I had, the ability to take painting classes in high school, and I did some, I didn't do so much with sculpture, a little bit of sculpture in college and things like that. I had the opportunity to try a lot of different art mediums, and quilting is the one that speaks to my soul. And so I gave up the others, and I still do a little mindless knitting sometimes, but just quilting.
Well, talking about needle arts, right? It reminds me of, like, I'm predominantly a knitter at this point of my life. And there is always these conversations about machine knitting versus hand knitting, and what's the real handmade and what's not real handmade. Do you get the same discussions about quilting? Like, why not hand quilt everything? Is the use of machine cheating in a sense?
Oh, absolutely. There's always been those sorts of discussions. I did have, when I was on the show circuit, I would have, usually older ladies would come into the booth, and they would say, "Oh, this is done on machine. That's not real quilting." But I was a hand quilter for a very long time. And I had to kind of come to machine quilting kicking and screaming, but the list of quilts that I wanted to make got longer and longer, and I knew I would never be able to get them all finished if I did it any other way. But the thing about machine and in the quilt shows, back in the day, free motion machine quilting wasn't really accepted either. I've been quilting long enough to remember those times. But the thing about especially free motion quilting, I think that I would tell people, when they would stop in my booth and say that to me. I mean, I don't argue, but, but try to gently make the point that even though you're using a machine to create the stitches, to have the needle go, the thread go up and down, you're still driving all of those stitches, unless you have a long arm that with a computer that you just push a button and it does whatever you tell it. Even if you're on a long arm with the handles, you're driving those stitches. It's a hand process. And so each person's approach and each person's style of free motion quilting is as individual as their fingerprint. And so I choose to think of it that way, that machine quilting is not one size fits all. Some of us are better at it than others, and some of us spend more time at it than others. And so it shouldn't be viewed as lesser, I think.
Well, when it comes to teaching other people to machine quilt, right? There is different machines. I'm sure some doing much better job than others. There is also different technical abilities of students. So what's super easy for one person and they would get it in 10 seconds might take years of practice another person. How do you decide on your teaching method when you have different levels, technical levels of expertise among your students?
That's a really interesting question. When I'm teaching free motion quilting, and I only do that in person, I have not attempted to do that via Zoom. You have to have enough material that's suitable for different levels. Some people are not confident with with the basics. Some people want to have the basics down but need something else. And I try to what I try to do in all my classes is to meet each student where they are, and to encourage everyone to explore their own creativity. It's tough though when someone brings sort of a second machine to a workshop because they don't want to bring their nicer machine, but then the second machine isn't able to do the stitches. A couple things that I say to people is think about the texture. Don't think about the individual stitches. If you have a bobble, like stitches that are a little inconsistent in length, or maybe a pebble turns more oval than round, let it go. Don't obsess over it. Just keep moving. And the other thing is perfectionism is the enemy of good free motion quilting, because it won't be perfect. It will never be perfect. And so sometimes those things help people to relax a little bit.
I watched you quilting actually, and you were creating some spirals and then something that looked almost like daisies out of those spirals. And what blew my mind, and I have zero experience with quilting, what blew my mind was how sure-handed you were with that. I was thinking my brain didn't even register where you were going, and it was already a perfect spiral. It's like when a student comes to you and tells you but I cannot do that, how do you teach them? How do you explain them? And how do you give them confidence that they can?
Well, what I tell my students is that it's a good idea to pick just a few, 2 or 3 maybe, motifs that you really like. So that spiral motif that I like, that has the kind of the jigsaw puzzle stippling around it, that was the second motif that I learned how to do. And it really just spoke to me. I loved the design of it. And so if someone doesn't like that particular design, I've got others that they can try. And I encourage them to master 2 or 3 of the motifs before they try to go out and do something, something more complicated. Because if you can get that feeling of competence under your belt, then it's easier to do something new. And a lot of times people are like, oh, it's just so boring to practice free motion quilting. So the way I did it was I made baby quilts and I gave them away. And not that, not that I didn't want to do my best work on a baby quilt I was going to give away, but babies don't care. And so, so I learned how to do some of these motifs, doing those sorts of things that it was fun. It was small enough that that it could be, done in the domestic machine without too much trouble. Pillows are great for that. Also table runners. And I gave it away. It made me feel good that I had done something. I had learned something new and I had, helped someone else. And by the time I'd done, I don't know, 5 or 6 of those baby quilts, I was pretty good at the basics. So that's what I encourage people to do. You do have to practice, but you can practice on something that's fun. You don't have to just practice on, squares of fabric that's kind of boring.
Is there a quilt in your collection that you would never give away or sell?
I don't think so. My quilts are, the interesting thing about my quilts is that I made them for years. I made them to be sold, and people would say, "How can you do that? You spent all that time on that piece, and how can you sell it?" The cool thing is that quilts don't usually sell right away. Sometimes they do, but they don't usually. So I have time to live with them for a little while. And by the time they're sold, I've gone on to something else. And so I'm happy that they get to go live with someone else who will enjoy them and love them, hopefully, as much as I do. And it gives me space to make something new. And so I used to get attached to my quilts, but I don't really anymore after that experience of making them to be sold. And I enjoy the ones that live with me now. And when they don't live with me anymore, then I make something else.
How was COVID treating you? Like, what was the best thing about it and what was the most difficult thing about it?
For me, I'm fortunate that I have a studio in my home. And so when I had to stop traveling to lecture and teach, I had all of my materials and supplies here, and I could continue to work. So that was really important for me. That was a good thing. It gave me time to work. It ended up that I thought I was going to have the time to make all those. I was going to finish all these UFOs, unfinished objects that were sitting around that had not been quilted. I was going to make some new work, and it turned out that I had to pivot to learning how to teach on Zoom. So that took up some of the time. But I'm basically, as I said, I'm basically an introvert. So tell me that I have to stay home and I'm like, okay, but it was hard, it was hard. And I don't mean that in any way to minimize the difficulties that so many people felt from having to be cut off. And that was the thing. I was cut. My mom lives in Florida. I'm here in Virginia. I just last week went home to visit her for the first time in 2.5 years, so being cut off from my family and from my friends and loved ones was for me the hardest thing about it.
Was it hard for you to learn how to teach over Zoom versus in person? Was it like the whole new set of teaching tricks?
Yes. I mean, it wasn't, I don't know. It was the nice thing for me was that I did it early. All of my contracts got canceled in March of 2020. But there was a group in upstate New York that said, we've heard about this thing called Zoom. And I was supposed to visit there in April of 2020. They said, would you be willing to, to do that? And I said, oh, sure. I had no idea what teaching on Zoom meant. I had been on some Zoom calls, as a participant, but I'd never hosted one. And I didn't know how to do, videos and lighting and all that. And so, but the people that, that took those Zoom classes from me in the beginning, we were all learning. We were all new at it. And so they were very They were very forgiving. And I learned fast. And I was, in 2021, I was really, really busy teaching and lecturing on Zoom. And I'm so grateful that we had that technology and we didn't have to just stop, and I think that Zoom is going to be around for a while in my world anyway, because it enables guilds and groups to bring in teachers that they couldn't afford to bring in, any other way. I'm starting to teach independent Zoom classes that I host myself, and I have students from all over the world that are taking these classes, and so that's really exciting. I think it's a wonderful opportunity.
What's your relationship with social media?
I love Instagram. I'm really active on Instagram, and that's my primary. That's my primary outlet. Basically, I have a presence on Facebook. I have a presence on Twitter. I have a presence on Pinterest and YouTube and all of those. But I focus on Instagram, and I love interacting with people. I feel like that's an area where I can focus on my art and on other people who enjoy art, and not so much with other, sort of things that are happening in the world. I try real hard to, I post regularly, and I try to engage with those that engage with me.
That like the quilting community, is it a supportive community? Is it the criticizing community who knows all the rules that you're breaking?
Oh, it's very supportive. It's very supportive, and I'm grateful for that. And there's a whole community of quilting teachers, those of us who teach on Zoom, those of us who teach only in person, and it's really a wonderful group. It's not cutthroat or competitive. We try to help each other, I just really love and appreciate being part of it.
What's in store for this year? What's your plans for this year?
Well, I am teaching, I'm continuing to teach on Zoom. I have an in-person retreat at the Woodlands Ridge Retreat Center in Wisconsin in August, in person for 5 days. I'm really excited about that. And I am going to have a solo show at the European Patchwork Meeting in France in September. So I'm making work for that. That's going to be really exciting. And, I've got plans for some, new quilts and new classes, and, it's going to be fun.
I can't wait to see what you're going to create. I love seeing pictures of your quilts, and they always make me smile. They always catch my attention.
Thank you so much, Irina. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being the guest of my channel today. I love talking to you.